In 1891, the night swallowed her footprints, and they believed fear would finish the job. 3 Rottweilers were released into the dark, trained to hunt, to corner, to silence. The men were confident. No one escaped for long. 8 hours, they said, was all it would take before the chase ended the way it always did. But the forest has its own rules. As the dogs disappeared into the shadows, something unexpected began to unfold, something no one could explain and no one would forget. This is the story of a girl who refused to vanish, a pursuit that turned into a reckoning, and the moment when power learned it was not as absolute as it seemed. The escape did not begin with courage. It began with fear, quiet, shaking fear that lived in her chest long before her feet ever touched the road. In 1891, fear was a constant companion for an enslaved girl. It followed her through the fields, into the cramped sleeping quarters, and into every silence where footsteps might suddenly appear. But on this night, fear changed its shape. It no longer whispered, "Stay alive by obeying." Instead, it said, "Run or lose yourself forever." She did not plan for freedom the way books describe it. There were no maps, no secret allies waiting with lanterns, no clear destination. What she had was exhaustion, memory, and a moment when staying became more dangerous than leaving. Something had crossed a line, perhaps a threat, perhaps a punishment she knew was coming, perhaps the slow realization that if she waited one more day, she would never find the strength again. Desperation does not announce itself loudly. It arrives as a calm decision made in the darkest hour. She waited for the world to fall quiet. The night carried sounds she had learned to read like warnings, the creak of wood, distant voices, the restless movement of animals. When the moment came, she slipped away with nothing but the clothes she wore, no food, no shoes fit for distance, no certainty she would see another sunrise. Every step away from the place she knew felt like stepping off the edge of the world. Emotionally, this was not a heroic sprint toward hope. It was a painful tearing. Behind her were people she loved and could not save. Ahead of her was a future she could not imagine. The road between them was filled with danger. Yet, even as her heart raced, a strange clarity settled in. For the first time, her body was moving according to her own will. The land itself became her first test. She moved through uneven ground, careful not to break branches or leave clear signs of her passing. She knew the rules without ever being taught them. Don't follow straight paths, don't trust open spaces, don't rest too long. Every sound felt louder in the darkness. Every shadow looked like pursuit. Her breath became something she had to control, pulling it in shallow, careful draws so it would not betray her. Fear sharpened her senses. It taught her when to freeze and when to move. It reminded her that survival was not about speed alone, but awareness. Still, desperation made its demands. Her legs burned. Her chest ached. Her thoughts drifted toward what might happen if she failed, and she had to force them back. To think too far ahead was dangerous. All she could do was survive the next minute, then the one after that. As the hours passed, exhaustion crept in, heavy and persuasive. It told her to sit down, to hide, to wait for dawn. But desperation answered back with something stronger than hope, resolve. Hope imagines a better future. Resolve insists on reaching it, even when the mind is screaming to stop. What made her escape especially dangerous was not just the physical pursuit she knew would come. It was the certainty of it. In 1891, escape was never treated as an act of humanity. It was treated as theft. To run was to challenge power, and power always responded. She knew they would look for her. She knew they would use everything at their disposal. That knowledge did not stop her. It fueled her urgency. This is the emotional core of a desperate escape, not the belief that one will succeed, but the refusal to surrender before trying. There were moments when doubt nearly won. Moments when the night felt endless, when the distance she had covered seemed meaningless compared to the danger still behind her. In those moments, memory became both a burden and a weapon. She remembered pain, humiliation, and loss, but she also remembered who she was before those things tried to erase her. Each memory sharpened her decision. Going back was not an option. Even capture would not erase the truth that, for these hours, she had chosen herself. The lesson here is not simple bravery. It is the power of threshold moments, those points in life when a person realizes that endurance without dignity is its own kind of death. Desperation, often dismissed as weakness, becomes a force of transformation. It strips life down to its essentials: breath, movement, choice. Her escape also reveals how freedom often begins invisibly. There were no witnesses cheering her on. No one marked the moment she crossed from submission into resistance. Yet that crossing mattered. Even if the world never acknowledged it, she had already changed. She was no longer only reacting to commands. She was acting on conviction. As night deepened, the world around her felt both vast and intimate. Trees became cover, darkness became an ally, even fear, once an enemy, became a guide. It told her when danger was near and when silence was safest. In this way, desperation refined her instincts. It turned her into something the system had never intended her to be: self-directed. This keynote is not just about running away. It is about reclaiming ownership of one's life in the smallest, most fragile ways. A step taken without permission, a choice made without approval, a refusal to accept that suffering is inevitable. By the time the pursuit would begin, she had already achieved something profound. She had proven to herself that she was not what they said she was, not property, not powerless, not voiceless. She was a human being who had weighed the cost of staying and found it unbearable. The desperate escape sets the emotional foundation for everything that follows. It fills the story with tension, vulnerability, and meaning. Without it, the chase is just movement. With it, every hour becomes a measure of human endurance, and every decision carries the weight of identity. In the end, the most important lesson of this keynote is simple but enduring. Freedom does not always begin with certainty or safety. Sometimes it begins with fear transformed into action by the courage to choose the unknown over the unbearable. Morning had not yet broken when the decision was made. Her absence was discovered not with surprise, but with anger, cold, immediate, and certain. In 1891, escape was treated as defiance, and defiance demanded a response. There would be no waiting, no mercy, no doubt about what came next. The chase began not because they believed she might be caught, but because they believed she must be. 3 Rottweilers were prepared and released. These dogs were not symbols of protection or companionship. They represented a system built on fear and enforcement, trained to follow scent, command, and expectation. To those who ordered the chase, the dogs were proof of control, muscle and instinct bent to human will. Their confidence was absolute. The land was familiar. The rules had always worked. People did not simply vanish. As the dogs surged forward, The mood shifted from irritation to grim certainty. The men followed at a distance, trusting the animals to do what they had been trained to do. This was not a frantic pursuit. It was procedural, measured, routine. That calm made it ruthless. There was no urgency born of concern, only the steady belief that resistance would be corrected. For the girl, the beginning of the chase was felt before it was seen. She sensed it in the way the world seemed to tighten. Sounds traveled differently, the air felt alert. Even without hearing paws or voices, she knew the search would come. Fear returned, sharper now, carrying a new weight. This was no longer just about running. It was about being hunted. The difference matters. To be hunted is to feel the world turn against you, every rustle potentially an enemy, every decision heavier than the last. Emotionally, this phase of the story is dominated by imbalance of power. On one side stood a system with tools, authority, and numbers. On the other, a single exhausted girl with fading strength and no guarantees. The release of the dogs was meant to end uncertainty. It was meant to turn the night into a map and her movement into a trail. It was meant to remind everyone watching that escape had consequences. Yet something unexpected happened the moment the chase began. As confident as the pursuers were, the act of releasing the dogs revealed their dependence. Without the animals, they could not easily follow her. Without training and force, their authority was limited. The chase exposed a truth they never acknowledged. Power that relies on fear is fragile when fear stops working the way it's supposed to. For the girl, fear did not disappear, but it transformed. Instead of freezing her, it focused her. She moved differently now, guided by instinct sharpened by danger. She avoided open ground. She doubled back when the land allowed it. She used water, wind, and terrain as shields, not because she had been taught these things, but because desperation teaches quickly. Every choice became deliberate. Every pause had a purpose. This is where the emotional tension of the story deepens. The chase is not just physical, it is psychological. The dogs moved forward with confidence, but the trail did not always behave as expected. Scents faded, paths twisted, time stretched. The longer the chase went on, the more uncertainty crept in, not for the girl, but for those who believed the outcome was guaranteed. Anger began to replace certainty. Anger at the delay, anger at the land, anger at the idea that something so carefully controlled could slip. The chase, meant to reassert dominance, instead revealed vulnerability. Each passing hour without capture chipped away at the belief that obedience could be enforced without exception. For the girl, every hour gained was a quiet victory, not a celebration, but a breath, a moment of survival added to another. She did not know how long the dogs would track her. She did not know if her strength would last. But she knew this, she was still free, and freedom, even temporary, changed how fear felt. It no longer meant inevitable defeat. It meant risk worth taking. The lesson of this keynote lies in contrast. The chase shows how cruelty often disguises itself as order. Those who released the dogs believed they were restoring balance, enforcing rules, correcting a problem. But what they were truly doing was revealing how much effort it took to maintain control over someone who had decided to resist. Ruthlessness, in this sense, is not strength. It is insistence born of insecurity. At the same time, the chase highlights an important truth about survival. Intelligence is not always formal, and courage is not always loud. The girl did not overpower her pursuers. She outlasted assumptions. She adapted faster than the system could adjust. In doing so, She shifted the meaning of power, even if only for a day. Emotionally, this phase of the story is exhausting. It presses down on the audience as much as on the characters. We feel the pressure of time, the weight of footsteps behind her, the narrowing options. Yet we also feel something else growing beneath the fear: resolve. The chase, meant to crush her spirit, instead clarifies it. She is no longer running blindly. She is choosing, moment by moment, to continue. As hours pass, the dog's presence, once terrifying, becomes part of the landscape she navigates. Not ignored, but understood. She learns their rhythm without ever seeing them. She learns when to move and when to disappear. This is not mastery, it is adaptation. And adaptation, in stories like this, is often the first step toward changing outcomes that once seemed fixed. The ruthless chase begins as a demonstration of control, but it evolves into a test of endurance, one that does not unfold the way anyone expected. It forces every side to confront an uncomfortable truth. Power does not always win quickly, and fear does not always obey. This keynote sets the stage for what comes next. It raises the stakes, intensifies the emotion, and challenges the audience to reconsider what strength really looks like. Is it the ability to command and pursue? Or is it the ability to endure, adapt, and continue moving forward when everything is designed to stop you? By the time the chase is fully underway, one thing is already clear. This is no longer just about capture. It is about whose understanding of the world will hold. Those who believe control is absolute, or the one who dares to test its limits. By the time the sun climbed higher, the chase had turned into a test, measured not in distance, but in time. 8 hours is not dramatic on a clock. It passes quietly in ordinary life, but for someone being hunted, 8 hours stretches into something vast and punishing. Each minute becomes an obstacle. Each decision feels permanent. Survival is no longer about escape alone. It is about endurance. For the girl, the first hours had been driven by urgency. Now, survival demanded something different. Her body was slowing, not because her will weakened, but because flesh has limits. Muscles cramped, breath came harder, hunger and thirst pressed in, dull but persistent. Pain stopped being alarming and became familiar. The real danger was not fear anymore, it was fatigue. Emotionally, this was the most difficult phase. Fear can sharpen the senses, but exhaustion blurs them. Thoughts wander, doubt grows louder. The mind begins to negotiate. Rest for a moment, hide longer, just stop. These whispers are more dangerous than pursuit, because they come from within. To survive, she had to fight not only what followed her, but what rose inside her when strength faded. She learned to move smarter, not faster. Instead of pushing forward blindly, she measured her steps. She chose routes that offered cover and slowed pursuit, rather than distance alone. When she rested, it was brief and purposeful, never deep enough to lose awareness. She listened to the land, wind direction, distant sounds, the subtle quiet that signaled safety or danger. Survival became a careful balance between motion and stillness. Time itself became an enemy. Every hour that passed without capture was a victory, but also a burden. The longer the chase continued, the more it demanded from her body. Yet those same hours carried meaning. Each one proved that the outcome was not immediate or guaranteed. She was not a helpless figure swept up by forces beyond her control. She was shaping events through persistence. For those pursuing her, the hours told a different story. What had been expected to end quickly stretched on. Confidence gave way to frustration. The dogs, trained and focused, did their work. But nature does not always cooperate with plans. Trails weaken, scents fade, terrain interferes, the passage of time introduced uncertainty. Each unproductive hour chipped away at the belief that control was absolute. This shift mattered. When a system relies on speed and certainty, time becomes its weakness. Delay invites doubt. Doubt invites anger. Anger clouds judgment. The longer the pursuit lasted, the more it revealed that domination required constant effort, and even then, success was not assured. For the girl, time worked differently. Each hour was proof of life, proof of resistance, proof that endurance could outlast force, at least for a while. Survival was no longer about reaching a specific place. It was about staying ahead of collapse, staying conscious, staying deliberate. She did not think in terms of freedom or future. She thought in terms of now. This is the emotional heart of the story. Survival strips life down to essentials. There is no room for pride, fear of judgment, or imagined outcomes. There is only the question, what must I do next to remain alive? In answering that question again and again, she reclaimed something powerful, agency. Even under pursuit, she was making choices. There were moments when hope flickered unexpectedly. Not hope for rescue or safety, but the quieter hope that comes from realizing you are still standing, still thinking, still moving. That kind of hope is fragile, but it is also stubborn. It does not promise victory. It promises continuation. And sometimes continuation is enough. The lesson of these 8 hours is not about physical strength alone. It is about adaptability, about pacing oneself when panic urges haste, about listening to the body without surrendering to it, about understanding that survival is rarely dramatic in the way stories often suggest. It is repetitive, uncomfortable, and deeply internal. The heroism lies not in a single brave act, but in the refusal to quit when quitting feels reasonable. Emotionally, the audience feels the weight of time alongside her. We feel the ache of waiting for something, anything to change. We feel the tension of uncertainty, and in that shared discomfort we understand something essential. Survival is not passive, it is active, even when progress is slow. As the 8th hour approached, the meaning of endurance shifted again. This was no longer just about escaping pursuit. It was about proving that the human spirit can persist under pressure designed to break it. Even if the outcome remained unknown, the process itself carried truth. She had endured longer than expected, longer than permitted, longer than planned, and in doing so, she forced the world around her to respond to her timeline, not the other way around. 8 hours of survival became more than a measure of time. They became a statement that a single person, armed with nothing but determination and awareness, could resist a system built on fear and force, if only by continuing to exist beyond the moment she was expected to fall. This keynote teaches a quiet but powerful lesson. Survival is not always about winning. Sometimes it is about lasting long enough for certainty to dissolve and possibilities to appear. And in those stretched hours, where fear and exhaustion collide, endurance itself becomes an act of defiance. The unexpected turn did not arrive with thunder or spectacle. It arrived quietly, carried on confusion, hesitation, and a moment when certainty cracked. After hours of pursuit, after confidence hardened into frustration, something shifted, and no one had planned for it. Up to this point, everything had followed a familiar pattern: escape, chase, endurance. The belief was simple: time would solve the problem, Yet time had done the opposite. It had complicated everything. For those pursuing her, the trail no longer felt reliable. Hours of effort had produced no decisive outcome. The dogs had moved, paused, redirected, and slowed. The land refused to cooperate. What was expected to be linear became tangled. The longer this went on, the harder it became to pretend that control was complete. An unspoken question began to surface. What if this doesn't end the way it always has? That question alone was the unexpected turn. Emotionally, this moment marks a reversal, not of power, but of belief. The pursuers had relied on certainty more than strategy. Certainty that the tools they used were infallible. Certainty that resistance was temporary. Certainty that fear would guide events to their desired conclusion. When hours passed without confirmation, that certainty weakened, and when certainty weakens, behavior changes. Irritation replaced confidence. Decisions became reactive rather than assured. Doubt crept into conversations, pauses, and glances. The system that depended on smooth enforcement now had to confront unpredictability. Something small, but critical, had slipped out of alignment. For the girl, the unexpected turn felt different. She did not know what was happening behind her. She could not measure the confusion she was causing, but she felt a shift in the rhythm of pursuit. The pressure eased, if only slightly. Sounds grew less frequent. The sense of being directly followed softened. That change was subtle, but it mattered. It offered her something she had not had before, space to think. Emotionally, this was a fragile moment. Relief threatened to become dangerous. To believe too early could undo everything. She could not afford hope in its full form. Instead, she allowed herself awareness that survival had already altered the situation. Awareness that time had worked in her favor in ways she could not see. Awareness that the world was no longer moving exactly as it was supposed to. This is where the story challenges expectations. The unexpected turn is often imagined as a dramatic reversal. Capture avoided at the last second, rescue arriving just in time. But in reality, change often begins as uncertainty, a delay, a miscalculation, a realization that the rules may not guarantee outcomes. For the pursuers, the turn exposed a truth they never intended to face. Their power depended on predictability. Once events became unpredictable, authority felt less solid. They could command tools and issue orders, but they could not command outcomes. That distinction mattered more than they understood. For the girl, unpredictability became an ally. She adjusted her movement to the new rhythm. She used the space not to rush forward recklessly, but to preserve herself. She rested more carefully. She chose paths with intention. The unexpected turn did not hand her safety, but it handed her possibility. And possibility, after hours of pressure, felt almost unreal. Emotionally, this moment carries quiet intensity. There is no cheering, no visible triumph, only the internal shift that occurs when someone realizes they are no longer simply reacting. She was still in danger, still vulnerable, but she was influencing the shape of events. That realization strengthened her resolve more than any burst of adrenaline could have. The lesson here is subtle but profound. Systems built on fear often appear unshakable because they rely on repetition. The same responses, the same expectations, the same endings. But when someone endures long enough to disrupt that repetition, even slightly, cracks appear. The unexpected turn is not the collapse of power. It is the beginning of its exposure. This moment also teaches us about patience. The girl did not force the turn through confrontation or strength. She allowed it to emerge through persistence. By lasting longer than expected, by refusing to conform to the timeline imposed on her, she created conditions where certainty could not survive. That is a different kind of resistance, quiet, sustained, and deeply effective. Emotionally, audiences often find this moment unsettling in a good way. We are conditioned to look for clear victories and dramatic shifts. Instead, we are given ambiguity, confusion, a pause where anything could still happen. That uncertainty mirrors real life, where change often begins invisibly and outcomes are never guaranteed at the moment they become possible. As the unexpected turn unfolded, one truth became undeniable. The story was no longer following a script written by authority alone. Another force had entered the narrative, human endurance, and endurance does not move in straight lines. It bends outcomes gradually, sometimes without announcement. For the pursuers, this realization was uncomfortable. They could continue, escalate, insist, but the sense of inevitability was gone. That loss changed everything. A chase without inevitability is no longer a demonstration of power. It becomes a gamble. For the girl, the loss of inevitability meant survival was no longer just delay. It was progress. The unexpected turn teaches us that control is often maintained through belief as much as force. When belief falters, even slightly, space opens for new outcomes. Not because the world becomes kind, but because it becomes uncertain. And uncertainty, for someone who has nothing left to lose, can be a powerful thing. This keynote stands at the center of the story. It does not resolve the conflict, but it transforms it. It marks the moment when the balance begins to shift, not through drama, but through disruption. Not through victory, but through endurance that refuses to fit expectations. In that quiet turning point, the story reminds us of an essential truth. Sometimes the most important change is not what happens next, but the realization that what was supposed to happen no longer feels guaranteed. Long after the chase lost its urgency, after the land absorbed the sounds of pursuit, and the day settled into uneasy quiet, what remained was not a single outcome, but a lasting truth. The events of those hours did more than test endurance. They rewrote assumptions. The lesson that echoed from this story was not owned by any one person. It spread outward, touching everyone connected to what had happened, and even those who would only hear whispers of it later. For the girl, the lesson arrived first and most deeply. Whether she was seen again or not, whether safety came immediately or slowly, something irreversible had already occurred. She had crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed. She had learned that obedience was not the same as survival, and that endurance could bend circumstances that once seemed immovable. The fear that once defined her place in the world no longer held exclusive power over her choices. Emotionally, this realization was complex. There was no sudden joy or celebration. Instead, there was a quiet, steady clarity. She understood now that fear could exist alongside action, that weakness did not cancel determination, that a single person, pushed to the edge, could still influence the direction of events, not through force, but through refusal to disappear. This internal shift mattered more than any external result. For the pursuers, the lesson arrived unwillingly. What they had expected to be a straightforward assertion of control had become something else. Reminder that power is not absolute. Tools can fail. Certainty can erode. Time can undo confidence. Even when authority appears dominant, It depends on cooperation from the world and from those it seeks to dominate. When that cooperation breaks down, even briefly, cracks appear. Emotionally, this realization bred discomfort. It challenged the belief that order was natural and resistance was futile. It forced an acknowledgement, however fleeting, that domination required constant effort, and even then it could be disrupted. This was not a lesson they wished to learn, but it lingered nonetheless. The land itself seemed to carry part of the message. It had sheltered, obscured, confused, and delayed. It had refused to act as a neutral stage. In doing so, it revealed something fundamental. Systems built on fear often underestimate the role of environment, chance, and human adaptability. Control assumes predictability. Nature does not promise it. For those who might later hear of the event, the story carried its own quiet power. Stories like this did not always spread loudly. They traveled through murmurs, half-told accounts, careful words exchanged in safe moments. Yet, even softened by caution, the message remained intact. Escape was possible, not guaranteed, but possible, and possibility changes how people see themselves, even if they never act on it. Emotionally, that possibility planted seeds. It challenged despair. It complicated resignation. It reminded listeners that outcomes were not always fixed, even when they seemed written in stone. The lesson was not reckless hope, but informed courage, the understanding that endurance could alter timelines and assumptions. At its heart, this keynote is about legacy, not legacy in the sense of fame or recognition, but legacy as impact, the impact of choosing to act under pressure, the impact of lasting longer than expected, the impact of revealing that certainty can be fragile. These impacts ripple outward, shaping how others understand risk, strength, and choice. The lesson also speaks to a deeper truth about humanity. People often believe that power is demonstrated through dominance and control, but this story suggests otherwise. Power can also appear as persistence, as adaptability, as the quiet insistence on continuing when conditions are designed to force surrender. This kind of power is harder to see and harder to erase. Emotionally, the echo of this lesson is bittersweet. There is no pretending that the world suddenly becomes just or kind. The dangers remain. The risks are real. But within that reality exists a counterweight, the knowledge that systems are not as unbreakable as they claim to be. That knowledge does not eliminate fear, but it changes how fear is carried. For the girl, this lesson became part of her identity. She was no longer defined solely by what had been imposed on her. She had defined herself through action. That self-definition mattered regardless of circumstance. It was something that could not be taken back, even if everything else could. For the audience, the lesson resonates beyond history. It asks us to reconsider where strength comes from. It invites us to recognize endurance as a form of resistance. It challenges us to see survival not as passive suffering, but as active decision-making under pressure. The echo of this story reminds us that change does not always announce itself. Sometimes it moves quietly, carried by hours instead of moments, by persistence instead of spectacle. Sometimes the most meaningful victories are internal, reshaping how a person understands their own worth and capacity. And sometimes the greatest lesson is this: even when the world is arranged to deny your humanity, choosing to act in defense of it. One step, 1 hour, one decision at a time, creates an impact that outlasts the moment itself. That is the lesson that echoes, not because it promises easy endings, but because it tells the truth. Endurance can challenge certainty, persistence can reshape power, and even in the darkest circumstances, a single human choice can leave a mark that time cannot fully erase. As the day finally loosened its grip on the land, one truth stood above everything that had happened. What was meant to be a swift punishment had become a quiet reckoning. An enslaved girl ran with nothing but fear and resolve. The chase began with confidence and cruelty, with trained force unleashed to prove that escape was impossible. Hours passed, strength faded, certainty cracked, and somewhere between exhaustion and persistence, the story changed. 8 hours of survival were enough to expose a flaw in a system that claimed it could never fail. This was never just a chase, it was a test of will. The girl did not overpower her pursuers. She did not win through strength or spectacle. She endured, she adapted, she refused to vanish on the timeline set for her. In doing so, she transformed fear into motion, desperation into clarity, and survival into resistance. Each step she took carried a quiet message. Control is not absolute, and endurance can disrupt even the most confident power. For those who pursued her, the lesson was uncomfortable and lasting. Tools did not guarantee outcomes. Authority did not equal certainty. Time, once trusted to enforce obedience, became the very thing that unraveled it. What they believed would end quickly instead revealed how fragile dominance can be when faced with human determination. And for those who would later hear this story, its impact lingered like an echo, not as a promise that escape is easy, but as proof that possibility exists, that even in the darkest conditions, a single choice to keep going, to refuse surrender, can reshape what seems inevitable. This story endures because it speaks to something timeless. Freedom does not always arrive with celebration. Sometimes it begins in silence, in fear, in a decision made when the cost of staying becomes greater than the risk of running. Courage is not always loud. Often it is measured in hours survived, breaths controlled, and steps taken despite exhaustion. In the end, what happened after those 8 hours mattered, but what mattered more was what had already been proven. A human spirit, pushed to its limits, can still challenge certainty, bend power, and leave a mark that cannot be undone. That is the legacy of this story, not just survival, but defiance through endurance, not just escape, but the reminder that no system built on fear is ever as unbreakable as it claims to be.